In the 1980s, during the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, no one in the West really disputed the Afghans' right to defend their homeland from invaders. And as we all know, the US was particularly supportive of the quote-unquote freedom fighters there. Here's President Reagan in his 1986 State of the Union address.
We're not alone, freedom fighters. America will support you with moral and material assistance. Your right not just to fight and die for freedom, but to fight and win freedom.
Reagan didn't just voice support for the Mujahideen. The US government spent millions of dollars a year funneling arms to them, from machine guns to grenade launchers to anti-aircraft missiles. By the late 80s, it had amounted to billions of dollars worth of military support. In 1988, the New York Times reported it was one of the biggest operations ever mounted by the CIA. The Afghan resistance even got the Hollywood treatment in Rambo 3. Remember that? Sylvester Stallone befriending Mujahideen fighters whom his best friend was training to take on the Russians. The Russians did pull out of Afghanistan eventually, but there were unintended consequences. Today, no one would dispute that the glorified Afghan resistance also included some, shall we say, less heroic, more extreme, often foreign groups of fighters who would use those very weapons and training against the West once their war with the Soviets was over. It's not the first time that that's happened in history, and it's also something we need to keep in mind today during this conflict in Ukraine. Back in 2020, former FBI agent Ali Soufan, who once led the hunt for al-Qaeda, and then Congressman Max Rose, together warned that just as jihadists exploited conflicts in Afghanistan, white supremacists are using the conflict in Ukraine as a laboratory and training ground. In a separate report, Soufan wrote that Ukraine had become a hub in the network of transnational white supremacy extremism, and that almost twice as many foreign fighters were traveling to join the civil war in Ukraine than to Afghanistan in the 80s. Just last week, extremism expert Cynthia Miller Idris, wrote in a story for MSNBC.com that, quote, among the well-meaning citizens lining up to fight for Ukraine are some global volunteers with links to white supremacist and far-right extremism, and that in recent years, global neo-Nazi fighters have sought combat experience with defense militias in Ukraine, most notably the Azov Battalion. Vladimir Putin has cynically tried to capitalize on those small pockets of extremism, on groups like Azov, saying one reason for his invasion was the need to denazify Ukraine. It's absurd, of course. Ukraine is a democracy in which far-right parties failed to get more than 2% of the vote in the 2019 elections. And as Cynthia Miller Idris and others have pointed out, the vast majority of fighters going to Ukraine today have no known ties to white supremacist extremism. This is by and large a legitimate resistance effort against a foreign invasion. But as we continue to send arms into Ukraine, we can't just forget what happened in Afghanistan. As Cynthia Miller Idris also wrote last week, the conflict in Ukraine raises serious risks for recruitment and radicalization in violent white supremacist extremist movements in ways that may ripple outward long after this horrific conflict is resolved.